Good afternoon or good morning if you're in the Pacific time zone. Our webinar topic today is what is the SAC's role in identifying and resolving data quality issues found in secondary data sets. So why this topic? Well, SACs routinely house and use secondary criminal justice data. That is to say, data obtained from other agencies with primary statutory or regulatory responsibility for collecting and managing that data. These are often other state-level criminal justice agencies that they themselves collect data from county, local, or other geographically specific entities. SACs use the data for their own research, and many SACs are acting as secondary disseminators of the data through online data clearinghouses and dashboards. An overarching question then is what, if any, responsibilities can SACs take on as secondary custodians of the data to identify data quality issues, outliers, inconsistencies, or missing data? What remedial strategies are effective, given that the SAC is not the original data management agency? To begin today's webinar, our three presenters will describe how they've approached these challenges in their states and how they've perceived their data quality control responsibilities with secondary data. George Shaler, Maine SAC Director, will describe their efforts at the aggregate and case levels to enhance police clearance data for bias and hate crimes. Dr. Justin Escamilla is the acting manager for the Center of Criminal Justice Data and Analytics with the Illinois SAC, and he'll explain how they employ multiple methods for examining criminal history records received from their state central repository that they use for research and tabulation. Dr. James McDonough is the Virginia SAC Director, and he's going to discuss a project to resolve issues of consistency and completeness regarding victim-offender relationships coded within their incident-based reporting system. In all three examples, the data quality improvements have implications for their use at case level and aggregate level formats. Then, in the roundtable portion of the webinar, we'd like to dig a little deeper and consider how these efforts to remediate data quality issues are impacted by the relationships between the SAC and the source agencies. Initially, I'll direct questions to the presenters on this issue. We will then open up a Q&A session during which you can ask questions to either a specific presenter or to the entire group in the manner described by Susan using the chat feature. So, George, if you are ready, we can begin.
So anyways, thank you for the introduction, Mark. I'm working on this project on hate and bias crimes research in Maine, and I've been working on this project with my colleague Hannah Brintlinger, and I've had the distinct pleasure of working with Jack McDevitt from Northeastern on this project. And for those of you who know Jack, Jack's a nationally recognized authority, if you will, on hate and bias crimes, and Jack's advice on this project has been tremendous. We've been on this project, working on this project for a little over a year. We got generous funding from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, so I want to give them a shout out, and I appreciate their support in doing this. We became interested in this. I became interested in doing this project because hate and bias crimes are periodically reported on in Maine. I live in a relatively small state, relatively small population, but we never know what the outcomes of these crimes are. There's no report that depicts outcomes. So we might know in a given year that there's 40 hate and bias crimes that are reported, but there's never any kind of report then, subsequent report done on what happened to these cases. Was there a perpetrator arrested? Was that person charged? Was that person convicted? And so I became interested in trying to do kind of a deep dive, an audit, if you will, of all of the hate and bias crimes done over a 10-year period. And so we wanted to establish some clearance rates, if you will, like how many of these crimes end up resulting in an arrest and a conviction. So that was where we jumped in. And so we picked a 10-year period from 2008 to 2017. So a little bit more background is we went to the FBI's Crime Data Explorer to see the actual number of hate and bias crimes reported during this period. And we downloaded those episodes. Now that data has an incident number, and it'll tell you what town it happened in, but not a whole lot more. So what we decided to do there then is to kind of construct a database, if you will, of all of these cases, to building on what little information we were able to glean from the FBI's source, and do so by asking law enforcement if there was a subsequent arrest. So let's see, why is that not going down here? Why is that not advancing? Let's see. Oh my goodness, now what? Let's see.
George, if you look down at the bottom left corner of your slide, there are some very faint controls down there, and there's there it
is. Thank you, Susan. Thank you. So just a little bit of background information on hate crimes in Maine. Over the first 5 years of the study, we found that there was more hate crimes or hate crime incidences being reported to the state's UCR system than there were in the last 5 years. And so that reflected a 43% drop. Nationally, the number dropped as well, but by not as much. So, that's a kind of an interesting finding in and of itself. But what we were really more interested in was, why, what's going on in these cases. So some of the challenges in doing this research is that, obviously with in some municipalities, localities, some of these incidences aren't frequently reported to police. So in Maine, some of these agencies might have a couple of hate crimes over a 10-year period, or those that they categorize. So it's not something that law enforcement in Maine has a lot of experience in dealing with. And so sometimes these crimes don't get reported as such because officers don't get frequent training on what hate and bias crimes are. And then as a result, if there is a hate crime, they may not categorize it or flag it, if you will, as a hate crime. And so we feel, based on what we've learned in this project, that 445 is probably a good undercount of the number of hate and bias crimes that happened in Maine, but that's what we have. Now, the other thing that we really wanted to get at, and it's something I mentioned earlier, is that very few states report out on outcomes associated with these hate and bias crimes, because often they're very hard to solve, like especially in cases that involve property damage. If someone has spray painted a place of worship, it's sometimes very difficult to find the perpetrator of that crime. But so we were, that was the idea behind this study, and that hopefully by the end of it, later this year, early next, we'll have some outcomes associated with those 445. But I'm really going to focus on some of the challenges in doing this today. So in Maine, when a hate crime is committed in which the perpetrator is found, there is often a two-track process. And this gets to some of the data challenges with this work, is that the Attorney General investigative office can bring what's called a civil order against the accused in order that they've violated hate statutes or civil rights statutes in Maine. in addition, if they've committed another offense, say they yelled a racial epithet against towards someone, and then they stole property from that person, then the district attorney in the jurisdiction in which the crime occurred will also file felony or misdemeanor charges or whatever. So there's often, what we're looking at here is we're looking at two sets of outcomes. Did the Attorney General do anything, our state Attorney General, and did one of our 8 district attorneys do something as well? And sometimes one will find the perpetrator guilty of a crime and the other will not. That doesn't happen a lot, but sometimes it does happen. So what we needed to do is we wanted to compile a list of all these incidences, and we requested information from all the main law enforcement agencies that reported to the UCR system. So we reached out to 65 law enforcement agencies that had a particular, reported at least through the UCR system, a hate crime during that 10-year period. And these are some of the things that we requested. And then we also, once we got that information, have reached out to the DAs and the state AG to look at, to determine outcomes. So keeping with the theme of this workshop is like data challenges and data quality, we are requesting information from a multitude of sources. A lot of the law enforcement agencies in Maine use very different systems to capture arrest information, though they feed it all through the up to the UCR system. So when we went back to them, sometimes some of the law enforcement agencies had changed management information systems during the study period, and it became very challenging for them to find older records. So, oh, I'm sorry, I went too fast. So here's the, so we, now, just as a kind of an aside, we sent, record requests to 65 agencies. That's less than half the agencies in Maine reported a hate crime, which we feel is probably not truly indicative of the number of hate crimes. For example, 2 of the top 15 municipalities in Maine, population-wise, didn't even have a single hate crime in that 10-year period. I happen to think that probably that's not a true reflection of what's happened in that community, but that's what was reported. So again, some of the records that we were asking for from law enforcement are in old record management systems that have been shut down. They were very challenging to find. A handful of records that were reported in the FBI's Crime and Data Explorer system were not known to the local law enforcement agencies in which we contacted. And then getting data from district attorneys and the AGs, we're still gathering data from the district attorneys and the AGs, so we're midway through that process. And that's been very challenging because there are very busy offices. All the district attorneys have the same database, but the AG maintains some of these records in an older record system that is only accessible with an ATN. They're older records that we're seeking from 2008, 2009 are in an older database that are only accessible with last name, first name. So we've had to go back and get last name, first name for the older records and then ATNs for the newer records. So that's presented some of its challenges as well. And whether, like we are actually getting the right information. So again, we are seeking ultimately data on this project that involves 450 hate crimes from 62 different sources, and they're listed right there. Of the 65, we got a great response. We got 51 of the agencies to send us back information. So that was great. There was a lot of interest by local law enforcement in this. 3 agencies told us they couldn't locate anything. With those only had 1 or 2 incidences, and they were in older systems, or they disputed whether they had actually had an incident. they questioned whether the FBI had the right agency listed. So that's a data quality issue in and of itself. And so of the 445, we got back information from local law enforcement on 399. So we feel really good about that. You know, we have roughly well over 85% of the information that we requested from local law enforcement, we're going to be able to go forward with and seek outcomes on from the DAs and the Attorney General. So again, we're getting information from the AG's office on if a civil order was enacted, and that the DAs are providing us whether they were charged and found guilty on other charges. And hopefully, again, by the end of this year, we'll have outcome information on that and be able to establish some clearance rates. My suspicion is that the clearance rates are going to be very low. These crimes are very hard to investigate and determine unless, now the personal hate crimes are more easy, but often they are they're pled down so that something that initially looked as a potential hate crime is pled down to say something amounting to a personal offense that would be something that would be taken up by a district attorney. And so these are some of the things. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. These are, we'll be later doing focus groups with local law enforcement regarding training issues, because we feel that certain hate crimes are not being reported as such because officers may not have sufficient training to recognize that the crimes that they're investigating are actually, or responding to, are indeed hate crimes. And so that is it. And if so I need to transfer back over. Let's see, how do I do that, Jason? The bubbles.
I think Jason can switch that, and then we're going to go over to Justin.
Thank you.
All right. Can everyone hear me? You see me just fine?
Yes, great.
Great, perfect. Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Escamilla. I'm the acting manager for the Center for Criminal Justice Data Analytics. That's with our research and analysis unit at the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. And I'm going to talk about our data sets and some of the data quality issues and processes that we deal with on a pretty typical basis. So I'm going to give a little bit of context about our data warehouse, is kind of the informal name that we give to our center. And then I'm going to talk about some of the data sets that we house and give some examples of some data quality issues that we've run into, just kind of briefly go over those. We can always go into more detail if we would like to. Talk about some of the data quality checking that we actually do, some of the questions we ask, go over some of the quality checkpoints, as I would call them, to look at, there we go. Look at some of the quality checkpoints, so some of the points along the way where we might actually look for data quality issues to pop up. And then I'll talk about what's to come for our center and what we could maybe be done in the future for data quality checking. I'm going to kind of breeze through this just because it's about our center mostly, but I did want to kind of preface this with some of the recent shifts that we've experienced at our agency. And so we've had some changes to the ways that we process and ultimately publish our data sets. We now publish them on a website called Research Hub. And we have a different way of processing them. It was a lot more manual in the past, and there's now a software that we use. We've also had some staff changes that were important. Two staff that were involved in those new endeavors, the software and the website, are now not with us at the agency anymore. And so I came on in April as acting manager, and so before that we had a lot of informal knowledge and that kind of stuff that we had to kind of pick back up on and run with. So. Lastly, we had a change to the way that we access the criminal history records that we use and share for research purposes that I'll talk about some of the implications of here in a bit. So like I said, we have the Research Hub. That's where a lot of our public data sets are housed, and we have everything there. Just for context, we have about 24 different data sets currently, everything from prison admission and exit data to criminal court case filings, uniform crime report. Those all come from different sources in different formats. and we publish those on our website for ease of access. We also have this internal data set, I would call. All of this is really secondary. We don't collect any of this primary necessarily. This is all coming from other agencies that have collected this. And so the criminal history record information, we have kind of restricted direct access to our Illinois State Police's production database now, and that was switched over from kind of a different database. So we have that information that we access internally as well, and we provide that to researchers upon request. So just to kind of preview a few of the data quality issues that we've seen, one thing that's not necessarily a surprise to us, of course, but it is something we have to keep in mind and we have to keep track of as we update our data, is uniform crime report data. And so we put that up on our website every year. We update that. The Illinois State Police, they publish that as Excel files on their website and in crime in Illinois reports. And so when they do that, they also publish the prior year's update to the numbers. And so we don't just update the most recent year's numbers, we have to go back and update those old numbers too. So just an example, something we have to keep track of there. We did run into an issue with juvenile court case filing data, and that was actually, at the end of the day, it was due to some issues in our data processing. But that whole process kind of came about from an issue that was flagged to us from an external researcher who was using that data set that noticed something odd. We actually had a conversation with our administrative office of Illinois courts, so I was emailing back and forth with them about what that issue could be. And we found out that some of the data had been flipped around. 2 columns in the data set had been flipped around. And so we took that down once we found out that there was an issue. And we are just at the point where we're able to start looking at getting that back up on our website. So we got that data corrected, we got it updated, and we're at the point where we can probably put it back up now. So regarding our actual criminal history record information data, we did, like I said, have an update to the way that we access that. So it's that was kind of a challenge for Illinois State Police in a technical sense, but also it required us to get newly connected to the new database. And so our programmer, Ernst Melchior, who's been with ICJ for probably, I don't know, many years, is very experienced in all this stuff, typically does checks when big changes like that happen. And one of the easiest checks that he does is just to look at the weekly totals, to look at the trend in arrests. And one of the things that we noticed was that the weekly totals of arrests declined to 0. And so there was obviously something wrong with that. We talked to ISP about that. We have several contacts there, technical people, manager people. And so we were able to work with them, and they got their issues figured out. We got connected into their system the way we should be, and we got that resolved. That just got resolved probably a couple months ago, and we're looking at updating our systems now. So another thing that maybe would be flagged for further discussion would be expungements. And so this is something we've always dealt with when we're asked to provide data to researchers. And so this comes up for us in 2017. There's a large expungement of juvenile arrest data. And so that's something we often mention to people who request data, or anytime we do a project with that type of data, we have to either put a really big data note, or we specifically mention to a data requester that we just can't provide any accurate data related to that. More recently, we've had cannabis arrests that were expunged in December, actually, and that was a lot of records related to that. But I'd be interested to hear how others maybe have dealt with that. And we're a little bit hamstrung in how we can deal with that for legal reasons, because once it's expunged, it's supposed to be gone, entirely gone. So there's not a lot we can do with that. There are a few things that we've thought of, and I can maybe talk about those. There's other data sets that we do get something like jail detention data, but the accuracy of that is really, we don't really understand how accurate that data is. And in fact, in the past, it's been an issue that the data that was in the jail detention files that we got did not match reports from other sources. And so, we haven't put that data up on our website. We actually took it down at the time. That was before I was acting manager, and it hasn't gone back up because we haven't been able to figure out what the issue was. And I think we just have to do some more work with that before we're confident in putting that up for anybody to use. In general, our web dataset checking is not really formalized. And so for the most part, large errors are what we might notice. So if a column's missing, a county is missing, those types of things would be easily caught, and that would trigger some kind of deeper review and could result in the dataset being pulled down or not being put up in the first place. Often this means we rely on users of the data to notify us of an issue, and then that will trigger a review. So it's not necessarily formalized in that sense. Our criminal history record information, on the other hand, is a little more regular and sophisticated. And that's often done, pretty much always done by our programmer, Ernst Melchior, who I mentioned before. So just talk briefly about some of the questions that are asked to check that type of data, the criminal history record data. I think some of the most basic questions that are asked are just to look at the totals, and I think that could apply to pretty much any data we work with in doing analyses, is to check our totals to make sure they are representing what we hope they, or what expect they would. So it's something like just looking at the totals from last year to the most recent year to see if there's any large changes, or if a specific county had a drop or a sudden increase that doesn't make sense from what we've seen in the past. Maybe doing an example pool from this year and doing the exact same pool from a prior year, or actually having done that in a prior year and comparing the results there. That could be a potential there. And that could maybe even help with something like expungements to understand how that affected at least aggregate data. Something like checking the data structure and completeness requires we're asking questions about the structure of the data, or the match between things like the arrest, having data on the arrest event, between the court dispositions, sentences, and having an arrest charge file too. So if we have a court disposition and a sentence, but we don't have an arrest charge or an arrest event that links to that information, then something's off, and we will contact ISP about that, let them know that we found that issue, and then in our data, when we pull down kind of a stag cross section of that live criminal history data, we will address that issue then, and we'll remove those records if they're not supposed to be there. And of course, just checking generally the correctness of the data. We are limited, obviously, in some ways how we can look at the correctness. We can't go to the source necessarily and check these types of things, but we can look to see if characteristics of individuals that are identified by a state ID are consistent across arrests. We can do things like check to see if there's multiple state IDs that a specific name and date of birth combination matches across, and do those kind of checks as well. And I can come back to some of those questions if we want to go over some of the details. So I think in general, we can look for issues in certain parts of this process. And one is just in the source data itself. Of course, you can have poor reporting, you can have missing data, you can have confusing dissemination if it's put out in multiple formats and multiple places and updated without too much communication about that. That could be an issue. In the pull down of source data, this isn't something that I think is often thought about, but it happens, and I've seen it happen. Corrupted or mislabeled files where some of the data doesn't get crossed over. We have limitations like in Excel with the limited number of rows that Excel shows, so you could be just cutting off data and not realizing it. And I think maybe more familiar to some of the CRY stuff we do is recoding and aggregating data into certain categories, into certain breakdowns. There can be coding errors there. One of the things we do is our programmer Ernst sends me the SQL code along with the data pulls that we do, so I can review that to make sure that it's reflecting what it should be. So just kind of a second data check on that, or coding check on that. And then obviously in publication reporting, people can mislabel things, they can mischaracterize the data. And one of the things we do there is we're required to review the reports that they're putting out so that we know how they're kind of representing the CRY data itself. I think for the future, you can see we have all these pieces of data checking there, and we have ideas, and we have a lot of expertise and experience with this type of thing. But I think we need a more logical flow to the way that we do these things, so that we don't miss things and we can explain when things do go wrong a little easier and more quickly, just more efficiently. So being able to do that, I think, would be really help us, and essentially having a checklist for each of those checkpoints that I covered would be really helpful, I think. We're looking to do a CRY audit revamp, so we do CRY audits, and I don't have a lot of knowledge or history with that because that was definitely before I came on board. We are looking to do a CRY audit revamp, and we have some ideas about things we can institute to maybe do that a little more automatically. And we also have this Arrest Explorer that's going to be kind of a public-facing CRY version. And there was a lot of thought around, making sure that the data that's being published there is one, as accurate as it can be and communicated, or that the caveats about the data are communicated as well. I just want to acknowledge, again, our programmer, Ernst Melchior, our acting research director, Jessica, and then the old manager, Christine Devitt Wesley, who was there for probably about 20 years. She was kind enough to hang on for a couple, 3 months and answer questions for me still, to kind of help me contextualize everything that we're doing. So that's all I've got here.
Well, thank you very much, Justin. That was an excellent presentation. Jim, are you ready to launch?
Yes, I am. Okay. Well, thank you all for attending this this webinar. I'm Jim McDonough. I am the director of the Criminal Justice Research Center in the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services. I've been with the SAC for 30 years, and I've been the director for more than 25 of those years. And what I'm going to do, which aligns with what this topic is I'm going to talk about a study that we did several years ago in our SAC, which was a study that was funded by our SJS grant from BJS. Thank you, BJS. Where we looked at the quality of how victim-offender relationships are coded in Virginia IBR data, or VIBRS data, as we call it. I'm not going to get into the details of our findings, but I am using this because I think it's a good illustration of the type of relationship we have with our Virginia State Police, which is the source of this VIBRS data, and how we work with the state police to identify issues with the VIBRS data, how they keep us informed about what's going on with changes to the data, and how we in our analytic role work with state police when we identify what look like data quality problems. That was critical to us for this victim offender relationship variable, because we do a lot of work for our state administrative agency when it comes to working with developing policies, procedures, working with grant-funded victim witness programs, where knowing what relationships between victims and offenders are is important, particularly in situations like domestic violence research and things like that. So again, what I'm going to do is kind of walk through this, and I'm not getting into the weeds of the findings, but just to illustrate how this relationship between the SAC and the state police, which is the source of the data for us, works. We've had a relationship with our state police UCR repository since Virginia started NIBRS data reporting in the early 2000s. So the data we work with, it's secondary data. We don't produce it. It comes from state police. We've got a long-standing relationship where the Virginia State Police send us a monthly file of their NIBRS data. Essentially, it's almost a duplicate of the file that they send to the FBI every month. There are some other elements Virginia has added to it. In addition to what the FBI requires, we get most of those as well. We've got 100% coverage, and essentially it's every law enforcement agency in the state of Virginia participating. So typically what we do is when we get these monthly files, we have an analyst who's been doing this for years and is very good with it, who essentially does a lot of dumping of frequency distributions for the various variables that are contained in the file, and looks at these distributions for outliers. That's really the first process in terms of looking for anything that might be questionable. We don't draw samples and audit them. We essentially just dump everything, and we've got a series of programs that basically looks for outliers in most of the variables and logic checks and things like this. And of course, the state police and the FBI, they also have logic checks and error checks built into NIBRS data, so those are already there. But we tend to be a little more analytic about it for our purposes. Our state police, they are primarily concerned with tabulating and reporting the data, moving it on to FBI. We're the ones that really, for like specific research questions, will dig deeper into it. And so we're more likely to find some of these data issues that might slip through theirs. In this study, what we did is we looked at 10 years worth of all of the person offenses or robbery. Robbery is considered a property offense in Virginia for some reason. And for victims of all serious violent offenses. And we just looked at how often and how well is the victim offender relationship coded in these things. And a lot of it was looking for how often is it missing or is it coded as unknown. And we looked at it two ways. One of them was changes over time, since we've got a 10-year time period. And then we also looked at it in terms of, well, how do different reporting agencies and different types of reporting agencies compare when we're looking at some of these data completeness and quality issues. So we looked at data from 120 agencies, which represents 96% of all the victims reported. We had a little over 1 million victims over this 10-year period in this data set that we looked at. And about 16% of those were victims of serious violence. That we tended to focus on the serious violence more so than the non-serious violence offenses. We looked at both, but we want to take a look at the serious ones. So we did that, and this just shows you kind of briefly what we found. We looked at simply, what do the numbers and the percentages look like over the course of this 10-year period? And as you can see, we had about 120,000 to 110 or 100,000 victims reported each year. And of those, the vast majority, about 80%, had a victim offender relationship that was known, coded, as opposed to a missing or an unknown. And we looked at victims of serious violence, which you can see on the right. The numbers are somewhat smaller. The percentages of knowns were somewhat lower, about 60%, and I'll talk a little bit about why we think that's the case. But essentially, this is what we saw in terms of just, how often are these VORs being reported, and how often are they being reported as something that's known. And we knew going in there were going to be some unknowns. Sometimes there's just no information available at the time that the report is taken. It doesn't get into the file. Sometimes there are reasons why an agency will actually choose not to report it. We found out, for instance, that police sometimes are hesitant to report a victim offender relationship if they're not certain that the victim or the person who's describing the relationship really understands what that relationship was, and they don't want to put it on record because they know further investigation might show that, in fact, it's something different. So there are reasons why we would expect a certain measure of unknowns. We looked at the type of variables where unknowns were most likely to be recorded in these. For example, victim was male and other race, Hispanic, or certain age groups, very young people, very old people. So we found that. And again, I'm not going to get into the weeds of the details of the findings, but I just want to show you some of the things we did to do these quality checks. We looked at it in terms of how many VORs are there missing or reported unknown by the type of offense. And what we found, and this wasn't surprising, that the sort of street crimes, if you will, like robberies and homicides, you had the largest percentage unknown, about 50% for homicides and robberies. Whereas when you had offenses where people are probably more likely to know the offender. Sex offenses, you had pretty low percentages of victim unknowns being reported, on the order of 10 to 20%. So when we did this, we set up some sort of logic checks. Some of them are already built into NIBRs. Again, something like, for example, spouse and a victim spouse must be at least 14 years old. The assumption is you're that old or more to be married. And we set up some common sense rules, like a parent victim, for example, has to be older than a child offender. So there were various types of just logic checks we looked through. And when we found some of these things just didn't make sense, we would take a closer look at those. And overall, we found that 97 and 99% of the victim offender relationships reported in all these cases, they were consistent with the other types of data elements that were reported. We did find some consistency issues when we looked at victim offender relationships that are, well, a little bit, I guess, less common. For example, child of a boyfriend or girlfriend, step parent, incest, things like this. And what we found, for example, when we're looking at the victim as a step parent, that in some cases it seemed like, well, in 15% of them, the reporting had the victim offender relationship coded backwards. They would look at the relationship of the offender to the victim, which is different from victim and offender. That's something we found you've got to take a look at. It's easy to get those two concepts mixed up when you're figuring out how to code it. One of the interesting things we found too, in a very small number, but out of 250 incest victims, 9 of them had a victim offender relationship coded as unknown. And of course, by definition, incest means that you do know who was involved with it. So those kind of things fell out of it. And then we looked at it in terms of the size of the different groups that were involved in the reporting. And you can see here on this screen how they're grouped using the FBI population groups. We kind of broke it down according to these groups and looked at how the reporting went within those. And what we found, if you see this slide, we're looking at all 120 agencies together. We had 82% of all those 120 agencies reported that, from 80% to 99% known primary VORs. Primary means we looked at single occurrences, one victim. We didn't use two. That got 2 or more victims. That got too complicated. We did have a small number, about 2%, that reported more than half of all their VORs as unknown or null, which simply meant there wasn't anything recorded for it. So those are the ones we wanted to hone in on. There's clearly something going on with the reporting quality if half of the VORs are unknown, when the state average is running something about 80% of them are known. And if you look at this slide, if you look at each one of these different agency reporting groups by population, if you look at the one I've got in red down at the bottom right, Group 9 metro counties, you can see there's a drop where you've got one locality, and these are very large localities, that reported only about 40% of their VORs as known. Now that really stood out. We had some others in the other groups, but that one I'm using for the example for this. So what we did is we took a closer look at this one agency that had more than 40% of the VORs listed as unknown. And it was a very large metropolitan police department, one of the largest in Virginia. And it differed from everybody else. So we wanted to know why that happened. And so the way we do this, and again, I'm using this as an example, this happens in other, looking at other variables too, but what we do is when we find these kind of things, we contact the UCR repository analyst at state police. And we tell them when we find these kind of things. And as I said, we've got an analyst who's been working with their analysts for quite a while. They've got a very good personal kind of collegial relationship. So we really don't run into any friction or problems when we do this. They you know, they're very professional in how they do this. We don't really get into, you know, turf or ownership issues or criticizing one another. It just really works well. And part of that is just due to the fact that they've got a good personal working relationship. So anyway, the UCR staff at state police, who are the ones that have to maintain the relationships with the reporting agencies that send all the data to them, they went back and they contacted this large agency, and they found out that they had this situation where the records management system requires coding for domestic assaults, and there are some types of situations that don't really fit well into the current coding system. Those things would default to unknown, and that was part of it. Part of it was training as well, but they didn't really catch this at either the local reporting agency or the state police. And part of the reason is they don't do these sort of in-depth analytical studies of this data. They tend to look more at aggregate data than we do. So what happened is the state police contacted the agency, talked to them about it, and they cleaned it up. We had another similar case where we found another very, very large agency had this huge spike in automobile thefts reported for 1 year. And it kind of slips below the state aggregate level checking. But when our analysts looked at it, it was huge for one locality. It was just completely out of the ballpark, like 25% or 25-time increase. We dug into it and found out that for one reason or another that year they had miscoded thefts of property from automobiles as automobile thefts. And when we pointed that out to state police, they went back to the reporting agency and they got it fixed. So again, we have that kind of relationship, and we respect each other in terms of not getting into criticizing, but we're all in this to try and figure out how to make the reporting better. It gets better for us, it gets better for them. In fact, state police often come to us now if they see anything that looks out of the ordinary and will ask us to check on it. So it's a good working relationship. And I think that's very important if you've got a source who's providing data to your SAC, to try and develop some kind of a good working relationship with the people in the providing agency. I mean, it's easy to get into, turf issues and ownership and stuff like that. But we've really found it's been very beneficial to both of us. They keep us informed about what we need to know to interpret the data. We keep them informed when we find something that might look odd that would slip by them. And it's something that we're trying to develop with other agencies as well. This one works particularly well. And I think it's just a fairly good model that's worked for us. And I think it would be something that might work well for other SACs as well if you're getting data from other agencies. And with that,
all right, thank you very much, Jim. All right, I'd like to bring Mark back up to moderate. I'd like to ask all our panel to turn their cameras back on. And also, folks, it looks like we are going to run out of time for this discussion today. So if you are interested in JRSA setting a follow-on discussion time, please make a note of that in the chat, and we'll see what we could do. But Mark, come on back and let's have a few questions.
All right, I'm back. I know we're running a little long, so I'm going to try to go to some of the high priority questions. Gentlemen, for the SACs that employ data quality measures, are steps taken to convey those findings to the primary data collection agency? And how do those agencies respond to those findings? Is there collaboration between you and those agencies in addressing the findings? Who'd like to tackle that one?
Well, this is Jim. I would just say that for us, yes, we also receive data from Department of Corrections, Sentencing Commission, Department of Juvenile Justice, and it is collaborative. We have a pretty good working relationship in that we basically everyone involved is very open to whatever other users of their data may have concerning questions or comments or identifying issues.
George or Justin, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I'll jump in. It's a little different in Maine. If I have a long and productive working relationship with the agency that I've identified some data quality issues, I'll bring it to their attention. Now, I don't circle back to them and say, "Hey, did you fix it?" I leave it up to them. If I'm working with a new agency, like some of the agencies that I dealt with on this hate and bias crime, I'm a little bit more deferential because I know that I'm trying to establish a relationship with them and I don't want to alienate them and jeopardize future research opportunities.
Justin, did you have anything?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a similar situation for us to maybe what George was speaking of. We certainly notify them. Whether that gets changed or not is not, necessarily up to us. It could be a while until that's changed. I'd be interested to know how long, Jim, how that took for them to fix those issues that you mentioned. Because that, the timeline can always depend on, their workload and that kind of thing. And whether it gets fixed could be, related to how difficult it is for them to fix that issue too. So.
Okay. Let me go in a slightly different direction, which is once you actually use the data, how do SACs deal with publishing things as the PI or the author using the data that you know is wrong, but have no authority to fix? Do you wait and try to get the responsible agency to fix it? Do you add footnotes and hope readers read and understand the limitations?
Yes. So Mark, I would list it, typically in a limitations section, or if it impacts the methodology of the study in any way, I would list it there. And again, I would be somewhat polite about, do it artfully because, these are agencies that will be reading the report and will be living with some of the consequences, if you will. So that's how I deal with it.
Jim?
Well, I think I'd echo George. If we identify errors in the data that we don't get resolved before we publish a report, we'll make some type of a footnote or a caveat. But again, to use George's term, I guess we do it in an artful way so that we're not trying to in any way be critical of the agency that provided, but we'll just find some diplomatic way of saying there were some issues that we identified and they might have this or that effect on the interpretation of the data.
Justin?
Yeah, no data is perfect, so that's always an issue, but it depends on the severity. So if it's severe enough that affects the implication or the conclusion and that what the data actually means, then sure, we just won't do it or we won't put it out. If it is something that you could just talk about as a limitation section, then we'll do that.
I'd like to squeeze in one more question if Susan will allow. Here's the question, slightly different direction. Do SACs that maintain data clearinghouses for external dissemination have an implied responsibility to identify data errors and outliers of externally derived criminal justice data? Should that responsibility include communicating data caveats to external data users of those clearinghouses? Jim?
Well, I'm not really sure I can answer that based on our practice, because we don't really maintain clearinghouses, as in copies of other agencies' databases that then we make available. What we tend to do is we provide data that are the result of analyses of those. And so in those cases, as I said earlier, if we identify issues with the data that we have to note, we'll do that. But we're not really in the position of, I guess, having to address that specific question.
Justin, I know Illinois has a pretty robust clearinghouse there for data. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, one of the things I can say that we practice is if we do know that there's an issue with the data, we don't put it on our website, or we take it down while we get that issue resolved. So something I talked about with the jail detention data, same thing with the juvenile court filings. We know that data isn't on our website because we knew there was an issue with it. And until that can get resolved, or if we can just maybe remove that piece that is incorrect and have that up in that way, we could do that. But until that issue is resolved, if we know about it, we're not going to put it out there knowingly. So,
George, anything?
We're like Virginia on this one. We don't maintain like a data warehouse of other sources. Now we are, the next BJS project I'm proposing, that is assuming it gets funded, and I shouldn't be so cocky about that, but we're going to be seeking some data from all our 8 district attorneys around the state for a 5-year period. And we've asked them if they could, in some of the preliminary discussions around the proposal, that if they'd be willing to put those data up on a website, and they have said yes. So we'll be checking on these kind of things in the next SAC proposal if it gets funded in 2022.
All right. Well, I think that's about as much time as we have for questions. Susan, did you have any concluding comments?
Thank you, Mark. I was going to say, Jason says that we have till 3:15. So I'm going to see if any of our attendees have a question. If so, folks, go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead and ask it. And then, Mark, if we don't get any takers, I'll let you ask the panel another question.
Very good.
So, let me see. All right, I'm not seeing any microphones unmuted. All right, Mark, then go ahead.
Okay. I guess as overall, from the experience you've had, are there some lessons learned that would be helpful to the other SACs in terms of ways of being proactive and addressing data quality, considering how integral it is to the work of the SACs? Are there any lessons learned that you'd like to try to get out to the other attendees at the webinar today?
Okay, I'll jump in. So, I think data quality issues hinge on the type of agency you're interacting with for research purposes. So, like the project that I described earlier, a large component of it was working with local law enforcement they are not typically engaged, especially the small agencies in Maine, of which there are many, in research. So, if they, if there's some missing information, it may not rise to a high priority with them, and I don't mean to throw law enforcement under the bus here in Maine, but, research is not their, contributing to research is not their main driver, obviously. And so, I think that's one of the things that we've learned is that, their ability to kind of fulfill research requests sometimes can be limited by their availability and their people power. So plan accordingly if you haven't already.
Anyone else on that one?
Well, I would just chime in again, I guess, reflecting some of what George said. It's from what we've learned, it's important when you approach an agency to request data to be very aware of what limitations that agency has when it comes to their ability to collect and quality control the data. Because I've seen it happen. As a matter of fact, it happened very early on when we had some folks at the SAC who went to state police when Virginia was just planning NIBRs and how it was rolled out. And the responsibility for doing that rested primarily with state police because local law enforcement collect this data. And some of them got pretty heavy-handed. They wanted it to do certain things for research purposes. And this is at a time when state police was really struggling just to sell getting localities to report the data at all. And over time, everything has evolved to where it's gotten better. But it's really, I think, important to avoid that sort of pointy-headed researcher attitude when you go to some of these agencies who are struggling just to be able to collect the data at all. You want to do what you can to make it as high quality as you can, but you've always got to be aware of the limitations that these collecting agencies have to deal with. I mean, you may not understand them, but they're often real, and you've got to go into it with that kind of awareness.
Okay. Let me take it back from the agency relationship issues to more of the process. Are data outliers and potential errors more likely to be discovered through some sort of a systematic data audit or analysis, or is it more likely to be discovered while it's being used? Those researchers and others who are conducting directed research and data tabulation.
I mean, I can kind of start off. I think it depends on the robustness of your checks. I mean, you can make, theoretically, you can make a system that could check everything, but at some point, people are going to be looking into a specific part of the data that you just didn't look at because you don't use it, or it's not a concern specifically to, a typical use case. So it depends. I think you catch a lot in a systematic way, an automatic way with some, specific processes, but there will always be things I think that are caught by users at some point. Just maybe minimizing those, I think, would be a priority for us anyways.
Anyone else on that?
Well, we just the way we approach things is we really don't do what you would call, statistically valid audit samples of the data. We tend to just dump it out and look at it as a whole. I mean, I guess ideally we should, but we just don't really have the time and the wherewithal to do all of that too.
Let me just, one last question, which I think will be very simple. One of the attendees was asking a question that I don't know if anyone can answer this off the top of their head or not, but is there a document or a book that anyone could recommend that provides comprehensive information about maintaining data quality? Any other resource, a website perhaps?
So Mark, one of the papers that I made use of many years ago in doing audits on data quality was actually written by Stephen Haas, who used to be the West Virginia SAC director, and he was doing an audit of criminal history records. And his methodology that they employed by the West Virginia SAC was fantastic, or it was for a newbie in this area. I don't know where I have that report, or whether if it's still in the West Virginia SAC report. But that's who, that was my first exposure to data quality issues and doing audits, large scale audits. And so if you got your hands on that paper by the distinguished Dr. Stephen Haas, that'd be a good one.
Yeah.
I will try to chase that down, George, and see if I can make that available for others.
One thing I would suggest is, and this is very dated. I don't have these anymore, but the Bureau of Justice Statistics back in the 1990s published quite a few good publications on how to conduct data quality audits. I think a lot of it was done after they passed the Brady bill, and there was a lot of questions about the quality of criminal history record data in particular. And
I was going to say that applied pretty much strictly to criminal history records, correct, Jim?
It did, yes, but there was a lot of just general methodology there, because I remember relying heavily on those during my early days at the SAC.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I think that's pretty much all the time that we have. I want to thank everybody for attending, and I want to especially thank the presenters for the excellent information that they presented. Susan, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Yes, I'd like to add my thanks to the presenters, and I'd like to tell the attendees that we will look for those resources that were mentioned, and we'll include those in the email that goes out. And then please do click on that link that Jason posted. Give us your feedback about this, and let us know if you would like us, because we did run out of time on this really important topic today. Let us know if you'd like to have a follow-on conversation, and we can schedule another one maybe sometime late next month. So please do let us know.
Thank you, everybody.
Right.
That'll conclude the webinar. Don't forget to fill out the poll questions.
Thanks.